All right. Hello, everyone. It's great to see you today. I know usually we are doing these Wednesday videos live, but this is actually Megan from the past coming to you in the present to have a little conversation today. So I want to introduce you all to Andro Hsu, who is joining us as our guest. Andro is a scientist turned writer turned marketer who has 14 years of experience transforming technological innovation into novel commercial products. And he does this across startups in health information technology, precision medicine, and the life sciences. And currently, Andro is the director of product marketing for ClosedLoop.ai. So, welcome, Andro. So glad to have you here. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So, if you don't know Andro or aren't familiar with his story, he actually has a PhD. And so, Andro, I would love for you to share with us just kind of a broad overview of how you were able to leverage your science background into a career in healthcare marketing, and also maybe a little bit of why you chose to go that path.
Yeah, this is a great story in that it looks like there's a direction to it on paper, but many times throughout this story, there was no direction. In fact, often what would happen to me is I would think this is the direction I would like to take next, and then I would end up moving out of what I was doing, but not end up in the direction I had thought I wanted to go. So I'll share a little bit of how that looked. I was doing a PhD in molecular biology at UC Berkeley, and I fairly early on knew that I didn't want to continue in the research space. And so I
Mhm.
was looking for essentially a side hustle, kind of an off ramp. I knew I wanted to finish the program because that was going to be of value no matter what I decided to do next. And I was writing op-ed columns for the Daily Californian. I saw that Michael Pollan had joined the journalism school at Berkeley, and I took a science journalism class with him called Following the Food Chain. And the end project was to write a long form magazine style science journalism article. And I wrote that for the class, and he loved it and was very encouraging of my efforts and complimentary about my writing. I actually, believe it or not, was going to go to more grad school after the PhD. So I applied to the UC Santa Cruz Science Communication Program, which is, I think, the oldest formal science communication program in the U.S. Got accepted there, and had about 6 to 9 months between finishing the PhD and when I would start there. Needed to pay the bills, and at the time, I don't know if this even happens anymore, but a friend at Stanford passed by a bulletin board in the hallway. There was one of those pieces of paper with the little tear off numbers.
Mhm.
And it was a company that was looking for science writers. And he said, Andro would be perfect for this. So I applied for that job and got it. And that was at a company called 23andMe. So I was employee number 7 as a science writer at 23andMe. This is before the product launched. And I had never worked in a startup environment or in kind of a software environment, tech space. And it was really exciting just being surrounded by really sharp people who very much cared about the mission of the company and how they were going to disrupt, if you will, disrupt genomics and make a difference. And
Mhm.
that I decided then not to go back to grad school. I stayed in industry, moved around, wore many hats as one does in the startup environment. Started to go down the software product management path with a couple different companies, and the CEO at a company I was at called SciApps took me aside one day and said, Andrew, you're a good product manager. You'd be a great product marketer. And again, having a scientific background, I've always been a little wary of marketing or a little
Mhm.
suspicious of marketing. I was hesitant at first, but I decided to do it and went into it, and I loved it. I felt that there was something about taking all this complexity and making it meaningful and connecting it to what customers and people cared about in their actual lives as it's impacted by the company's products to be a very fulfilling set of activities.
Mhm.
Since then, I've been mostly on the product marketing side, some full stack, I've always had to write. That's been definitely a common thing across all of that. And I think marketing is one very, it's an application of a technical background and writing mixed together that if you have both of those things, you can get very far. There's a lot to be able to do within the sphere of marketing.
Yeah. The podcast interviewer in me is like, I mean, we could go in 10 different directions just based off of that initial explanation. But I'm really curious to hear with your background, having gone through a PhD program, I imagine that involves a lot of writing, right? Like there were plenty of opportunities for you to practice that skill. And it sounds like even within and beyond that experience that you also had other opportunities to do different types of science writing. I'm wondering, for people who have a health professional background, like maybe they are pharmacists or nurses or physicians, and they haven't necessarily had those opportunities to write a lot. Are there any things that you did to help you hone that skill of writing, or are there any recommendations you have for someone who has that interest in maybe going down a healthcare marketing path, but doesn't really have the writing portion of that experience?
I will say that the scientific style of writing is very different from a marketing style of writing, and not just for sort of what might be the most obvious reasons. But I can get into that a bit later. I think as coming from a healthcare field, you hear a lot of stories about how tech doesn't understand healthcare and how technical co-founders think they can solve things and with a new device or a new piece of software, and it's simply not the case. Healthcare is fundamentally a personal delivery of care, whether it's by a clinician in the clinic or increasingly by care management and patient management services that are associated with clinical well-being, but are outside of the actual direct practice of healthcare. I think healthcare practitioners understand that very well, and probably the best thing that a content marketer or any sort of writer can have in speaking to an audience is to have been on the audience's side. Mm-hmm. So in this case, if a career path you might be considering is writing content that in some way needs to appeal to or bring in a healthcare audience, having had the experience of being a healthcare practitioner is a huge, huge advantage because you have been and experienced the day-to-day pains and challenges of what it is to practice healthcare. And when you also are more acquainted with the kinds of things that you as a healthcare practitioner would have been looking for when you were looking for content. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge advantage, essentially walking in the shoes of in this case, not walking in the shoes of your customer, which is, kind of if you can go into sales and be very effective if you have been the buyer of your own product. That's walking in the shoes of your customer. Here, it's walking in the shoes of your reader or your viewer or the consumer of content. So taking that experience and making sure that infuses how you write and your tone and your approach and the understanding of the needs of your audience is really, really advantageous.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that advice. I completely agree. And now that you've brought up content marketing specifically, I mean, we've worked together before, so I kind of have a feel of your response to this question. But for folks who are watching who might not know, my background is in various types of medical and health writing. And about 4 years ago, I settled into the space of health content marketing, and inclusive of content strategy and writing. How do you, in your role as a product marketer, how do you perceive the value of content marketing in the healthcare space? So whether that's health tech, precision medicine, some of those other areas that you've kind of focused in, how do you perceive the value of content marketing in those specific spaces?
Yeah, to go back to this perception that technology companies don't understand healthcare, probably the number one thing that you can do to sort of avoid that is the content that you publish can demonstrate that you as a company care about understanding healthcare and how it's practiced, and then actually show that you have an understanding of the day-to-day pains and challenges and goals and ambitions of your potential customers. And so you can't actually write content that does that without actually taking the effort to understand and speak to customers and to the market. Ideally, having been, you would have been part of that audience. And so, when we worked together, I was working for InsideRx, which is a precision dosing company. We we're selling to hospital pharmacy, health system pharmacies. So your background, having a PharmD, was, it's not obviously the only reason that I wanted to work with you, but that was like something that I knew would be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
You having understood what pharmacy specialists actually are going through day to day is helps a company better understand their customers and their market, as well as communicate to that market that they understand.
Mm-hmm.
Now, then, you might find some schools of thought which say that, well, content marketing is for lead generation. And yes, it is useful for lead generation. But I'd say that it's not going to be very effective for lead generation unless you show that you understand your customer, and unless you show that you've taken the time to really think about their problems, so that after becoming familiar with your brand and being familiar with the type of content you put out, they're more likely to trust you and say, you know what, it sounds like these people really get what I'm going through. And
right.
Yeah, I'll book the meeting. I'll see that demo. I'll send my email, whatever it is.
Yeah, it helps to build that relationship and that trust, so that it's not just that you're capturing someone's attention, or that, they see your name, or they are familiar with what you do, but it's that you also are conveying to them the value that you offer, so that then they're kind of more likely to engage with you, or to be interested in engaging with you on that level, on a deeper level. All right. So in your roles, you've led marketing teams, and so I imagine that maybe earlier in your career, a larger brunt of the execution kind of fell on you. But then, as you advance and move into different roles, maybe you are responsible for other people who are kind of executing, right? So are there particular attributes that you look for when you work with a writer, whether that's a content writer or what have you, who's helping to support your overarching marketing goals?
Yeah, definitely a couple things, and it's definitely true that if you have a scientific background or a technical background or healthcare background, the concepts and being able to write about the more complex concepts in healthcare or technical aspects, those will be easier for people with this kind of background. However, I alluded to this earlier, that the scientific style of writing is very different from the marketing style of writing. And what I will look for in a writer is what I call the flip. In scientific writing, you look at the structure of a paper. It's, you give an introduction. This is a background. This is the methods. These are the results. And then you get to the conclusion. Whereas in journalism and marketing, somewhat by extension, you have the inverted pyramid, right? And it's always with the assumption that you have your readers or your audience has a limited attention span. So like with journalism, if somebody only saw the headline, what is it that you'd want them to take away? And so that's why the headline of an article, of a news article, is always a certain fact or some happening, some event. And if nobody reads the rest of the article, they still take something away. And this is also useful advice for giving presentations. If somebody only was looking at your first 3 slides and then was spending the rest of the meeting on their phone, what is it that you want them to take away? And I try to encourage that. It's hard to do, but I try to encourage that in my own writing and in writers I work with. Start with the takeaways much higher than you would sort of instinctually think to put them. We usually think conclusions come at the end. They need to be very, very high up, if not in the headline itself. Now, there's all sorts of nuances, like, yes, you can get people to read on having sort of very engaging headlines and headers. And yes, there's an art to that, but getting out of the I'm going to tell everything chronologically as it happened mode of thinking is very important. Yeah, and then the other thing I look for is somebody who asks really good questions, right? So a lot of writing will start with interviews as research, and how well you can hold a conversation that keeps your interviewee speaking more in informative ways. You don't ask, for example, yes or no questions. You ask open-ended questions, and kind of being able to riff off of what somebody's saying to get at what is going to be really meaningful for your story, whether it's a case study or something that you want to include in other forms of marketing content. So.
Yeah, I love those pieces of advice. And you mentioned journalism earlier. I think based on what you've shared, anyone who's watching this who is kind of interested in learning what more of the non-scientific style of writing is, could do well by studying journalism as well. Like not just the blog posts you see or the articles that you see, but also just like go to a news website and read the way that they format those articles and listen to the ways that they have interviews. And I think that'll give a lot of insight too. So last couple of questions, just to kind of round it out. If there is someone who has a health background and is interested in moving into the marketing space, but hasn't really done that yet, they're sort of a beginner or a pre-beginner even, do you have any particular piece of advice for them? And then I would ask the same question of someone who maybe has already transitioned into that marketing space, but is looking to advance.
It's a couple thoughts there. The actual distribution of your content and how to get out there are so many different approaches to take. But I think what a very successful approach can be, that no matter which medium you choose will be effective, is treat everything as a conversation. So kind of approach the world as you're a newcomer to everything, whether you are or not, and stories will kind of naturally evolve that way. So podcasting is a really great way to get into that, because you're just having a conversation. And again, if you are sort of take an open-minded approach, you're learning on behalf of your listeners or viewers for a podcast. People are very effective in posting some thoughts about topic X on LinkedIn and then asking for thoughts. Like the most effective posts that I've seen on LinkedIn that then can turn into blogging or longer medium posts are things that start with thoughts and then solicit comments and then continue to have a conversation. So I think today it's not so much right. You still have to be a good writer, I think, to convey concepts clearly. But I think it's also about finding interesting conversations and being genuinely open to that. And then you'll never be short of topics to write about. Your audience will sort of find you based on the interesting conversations you have, and the idea that if they follow you as a writer, they'll be learning more about things that they're also interested in. So that's kind of the advice I would give, is like find ways to have open conversations about anything, everything.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Andro. I really appreciate your time. And if folks have questions about the conversation, feel free to leave them in the comments. And if Andro happens to see them, maybe he'll chime in, but I'll definitely be down there chiming in with you all.